So I was probably one of the few people who was not really looking forward to this thing with while foaming at the mouth. I am, of course, talking about the first of two nights of Arrow and Flash crossover episodes. Now, first of all, I have to explain my reasoning for not salivating at the mouth at the prospect of this. First of all, I don't think Flash has had quite enough time on its own yet. Remember, Arrow had at least 1.5 seasons before it introduced the character of Barry Allen, and even then, it didn't do any full-fledged crossovers until now, which is well into its third season. Whereas The Flash, they have already had an episode with Felicity. In the first episode, they had a cameo by Oliver Queen. And now, for their 7th or 8th episode, they are doing a crossover. So there's that, and in addition, if the promos were an indication, they were going to turn it into a fight. They were going to turn it into an event, sort of like a wrestling event. See Arrow fight the Flash. And most of the time when I see that, I'm just thinking, this sort of just reeks of desperation. This sort of reeks of marketing. It's like I know they're trying to appeal to the teenage or the males in the audience who crave violence and want to see these two characters go at it. And I sort of compare it to the two versions of well, not really two versions, but I sort of compare it to my comparing of the 90s crossover between the Batman and Superman animated series, and then the episode in The Batman in the mid 2000s where Superman showed up, and they had what would have been a crossover had that version of Superman gotten his own story. And in the 90s version, the Batman and Superman did not fight. I mean, yeah, they did have a little bit of conflict, and they did have to get used to one another, and whatnot, but they did not fight. Whereas in the 2000s version, which was definitely more aimed for kids, really the fundamental nature of the Batman show was to have sort of more of a, for lack of a better term, superhero show quality to it. They did have the characters fight because it was a Saturday morning cartoon, whereas the 90s one did not go for that traditional, I don't want to say archetype, but go for that traditional formula of having your heroes fight. And I felt like this episode, or at least how it was marketed, really went back to that. So without further ado, the episode itself I thought was good. I didn't think it was anything groundbreaking, but I thought it was good. So the basic plot is Barry comes across this new metahuman who can induce rage in anyone he makes eye contact with. So this causes a lot of people where he's been to become violent and hostile toward each other. While at the same time, Oliver, Felicity, and Diggle, no word yet about Roy. I don't know where Roy was, honestly, but Oliver, Felicity, and Diggle, they came to Central City because they were tracking Captain Boomerang, who showed up at the end of the previous episode of Arrow, who was played by Nick Terabay, Asher from Spartacus. So this episode does have the potential to become very messy, and for the most part, they avoid that by omitting certain things. For instance, Captain Boomerang is nowhere to be seen in this episode, and I hate to say this, but the villain was also not memorable this time around on the Flash's end. And I really don't like saying that because I really get that this is a talented, creative team, especially now that they've got Jeff Johns on the Flash side. But honestly, if they tried to make this particular villain memorable, then I think they would have had a very hard time preventing the episode from becoming messy. As a result, most of the screen time is devoted to the conflict and the interactions between the Flash characters and the Arrow characters, and the villain is virtually non-existent. The villain, more than anything, is the anger emotion. So, and what I mean by that is that Flash makes eye contact with this villain because he rushes in. He wants to prove himself to Oliver. He wants to prove that he can get the job done while Oliver is saying, like, you're undisciplined, you're untrained, you just rush in without thinking about it, which he does. He has done, and that's what he has done throughout this show, and that's what has gotten him into trouble before. And as a result, Barry gets all hostile. So that makes yet another thing that would have prevented me from liking this episode is they're doing the old black suit Spider-Man thing where all of a sudden the hero is in possession of some object or something that the plot has written them to have that makes them just suddenly hostile. And I hate when shows and movies do that, with a few exceptions. I think The Lord of the Rings is one of the few exceptions, but whenever shows and movies do that, I have a hard time connecting with the characters because they don't really act like how a normal person would act. They act overly angry, they are occasionally over the top. They're not reasonable in the least, so I can't really relate to them in the same way. But for the most part, they saved that until the end. They didn't actually have Barry get hit with this until the end. And while I still think to a certain extent it was sort of a cheap way to get the Flash and the Arrow to fight, I do think they handled it in a very mature way. And I know I'm kind of going off on many tangents regarding my expectations for this episode, but when you do a superhero fight between two well-established characters, whatever you do, you're going to piss off fans of either side, no matter what the outcome is. I cannot tell you how many times that I've seen little scuffles between Batman and Superman, and the Batman fans are like, "Oh, Batman's smarter, so he should have won." Or in the case of The Dark Knight Returns, when Batman won and beat up Superman, I saw a bunch of Superman fans saying, "Oh, he had help." So either way, you're going to have fans on either side who are angry, and the fact that they had it be a draw, in addition to having the heroes' respective teams sort of place their bets, as it were, I thought was actually a really clever way to go about it. And as for the rest of the episode, Iris, I still don't like. Again, I don't hate her, but again, I don't really like her. The fight scene itself, I thought, was really well staged. Obviously, we can't have the Flash go full power because A, he's a newbie, and B, he would just demolish the Green Arrow. Because if we had the fully powered up Flash utilize the Speed Force or go at top speed just around the world in a few seconds, if we had that Flash, then the fight will be over before it started. So the fight, I thought, was really well staged. Each hero really utilized their strengths and weaknesses. So Oliver, he's smarter, he's more disciplined, he's more experienced. So he got a few good shots in. Meanwhile, Barry, in terms of brute force and having the obvious speed advantage, he also got many good shots. So again, I thought this fight was very well staged. And for the episode overall, what I also liked is that it was still Barry's story, because what you could have honestly done if this was not handled correctly was bringing this character of Oliver Queen, who is way more established and way more developed than Barry at this point. You could have had him potentially steal the show from Barry. You could have had Oliver steal the spotlight from what is supposed to be Barry's own show. But luckily that did not happen. Oliver Queen and his team were very much supporting characters this time around, which was appropriate. This is called The Flash, and The Flash is still developing. It's still in its relatively infant stages, at least compared to Arrow. So I did think it was fitting that The Flash and its characters should get most of the screen time. However, just from a fan perspective, I did not like how Dr. Wells and basically the entire staff of Star Labs, including Joe West, knew Oliver's identity by the end. I did not like that, but yeah, aside from that, and aside from some very painful and forced deliveries, once Barry actually became angry and vengeful, especially toward Eddie Thawne, then I thought the episode really sort of fell apart at those points. I thought it got really kind of contrived. But aside from that, this was a good episode. It was a decent crossover. Do I think it could have been stronger if it was a multi-parter? Possibly. Actually, probably. They would have had a more developed villain. Or again, I think it was a mistake to try and introduce a new villain while at the same time trying to balance out the characters of the Flash and the Arrow. Because, I'm sorry to keep making this comparison, but when it comes to the 90s animated Batman and Superman shows, those characters were already well established on each show. Batman was well established. The Joker was well established. Lex Luthor was well established, and most importantly, Superman was well established. So you had 4 well-developed characters at that point coming together for one movie. And it wasn't really a Superman episode per se. Well, technically it was. It was 3 Superman episodes. Again, another advantage. It was able to take its time much more. But also, you weren't trying to introduce new villains, which this episode tried to do. And it was really more of a dual story. Whereas this, since it's only one part, not counting tomorrow night's Arrow episode, since it's only one episode of The Flash, I think they made most of the right decisions in terms of the focus and in terms of devoting screen time to which characters. Each character I felt got the appropriate amount of screen time. Firestorm actually looked really good. For a TV budget, that Firestorm tease at the end with Robbie Amell, that actually looked really good in terms of the CGI and whatnot. But again, good episode, not great, not groundbreaking. It's not one of the big TV crossovers that people are going to remember, I don't think. At least not in terms of storytelling. But again, I'm glad I watched it. It actually managed to avoid a lot of the problems that I thought it would fall into. Do I think it should have been later in the Flash's run? Probably, yeah. Yeah, I do. But at the same time, I still enjoyed myself, and that's the important thing. The characterization was there for the most part, except when Barry became all angry and angsty and whatnot. I liked the character interactions, especially from the supporting characters. Once again, they came up with a good reason for Arrow to be there and some very reasonable interactions between him and Barry. The comedy was still there. Barry's like, "You shot me?" So that was funny. The action scenes were well staged, and yeah, for the most part, I enjoyed myself. And for something that I did not have to pay for, like what Batman vs. Superman, the upcoming Batman vs. Superman movie is asking. They're asking that I shell out $8. I don't really know how I can complain, this being TV. And for one episode, without any prior setup, this was actually very accomplished, all things considered.